Captain Sarah Chun stood at the viewport of the U.S. Resilience, watching the massive space station grow larger as they approached. The Nexus hub was an impressive sight, a sprawling structure of gleaming metal and energy conduits that housed representatives from dozens of galactic civilizations. But what caught her attention wasn't the station's beauty. It was the warning beacons flashing around it in every language imaginable. Danger! Extreme environmental conditions ahead. Hazardous atmospheric composition. Radiation levels exceed safety parameters. Gravity fluctuations detected. Lieutenant Commander James Rodriguez joined her at the viewport, reading the warnings with amusement. They really don't want anyone getting close, do they? Sarah chuckled. According to the invitation, this is supposed to be the most dangerous gathering in galactic history. Representatives from every major civilization meeting on a station that orbits 3 different death worlds simultaneously. And they invited us because, apparently, humans have a reputation. Sarah pulled up the official invitation on her tablet. Listen to this. The Galactic Council hereby requests the presence of human representatives at the Deathworld Environmental Summit. Your species' unusual tolerance for hazardous conditions may provide valuable insights into survival protocols for extreme planetary colonization. James laughed. Unusual tolerance? That's one way to put it. The comm system crackled to life. U.S. Resilience, this is Nexus Hub Control. Please state your business and prepare for hazard assessment. Sarah activated the comm. Nexus Hub Control, this is Captain Chun of the U.S. Resilience. We're here for the Deathworld Summit. A long pause followed. Then, a different voice came through, deeper, with the telltale harmonic distortion of a Thylorian translator. Captain Chun, this is Administrator Vexthal. Are you certain your vessel is properly equipped? Our environmental conditions are challenging. We'll manage, Sarah replied simply. Another pause. Captain, I must stress the severity of our situation. The station currently orbits Kepler 442c, a world with surface temperatures reaching 200 degrees Celsius, atmospheric pressure 30 times your Earth standard, and radiation levels that would sterilize most organic life within hours. We will be transitioning to Proxima Centauri D tomorrow, a frozen wasteland with gravity 4 times your homeworld normal. The day after, we orbit TOI 715b, where the atmosphere is composed primarily of sulfuric acid vapor. James raised an eyebrow at Sarah, who simply shrugged. Sounds like a typical Tuesday for a human colony ship. Control. Permission to dock. Very well. Docking Bay 7. Please ensure your environmental suits are rated for extreme conditions. As they moved toward the docking bay, Sarah noticed something interesting. The other ships in the area were massive, easily 10 times the size of the Resilience. They bristled with environmental shielding, radiation deflectors, and what looked like miniature atmosphere processors. Look at that Zephyrian cruiser. James pointed to a ship that resembled a giant metallic flower. It's got its own gravity field generators running at maximum output. And that crystalline collective vessel is practically wrapped in energy shields, Sarah added, observing a ship that looked like it was made of living crystal. They're all taking this very seriously. The docking procedure was surprisingly gentle. As they settled into the docking clamps, Sarah could feel the slight vibration of the station's environmental systems working overtime. Through the airlock window, she could see other representatives disembarking from their ships, all wearing elaborate environmental suits that made them look more like walking tanks than diplomats. A Thylorian delegate shuffled past, its suit so bulky it could barely fit through the corridor. The being inside was completely enclosed in what appeared to be a personal atmosphere bubble. Behind it, a group of Aquarian representatives moved in what looked like mobile fish tanks, their water-breathing forms visible through the transparent aluminum. Should we suit up? James asked, watching the parade of heavily protected aliens. Sarah checked the atmospheric readings on her tablet. Oxygen levels are a bit low, temperatures running hot at about 45 degrees Celsius, and there's some radiation, but nothing worse than what we dealt with on Mars before the terraforming was complete. She grabbed a light jacket from her pack. This should do it. They walked through the airlock in their standard uniforms, James carrying only a small radiation detector that beeped occasionally. The moment they emerged into the station proper, every conversation in the corridor stopped. A tall, insectoid Mantari delegate nearly dropped its breathing apparatus. By the sacred hives, they're not wearing protection suits. Are they insane? Whispered a Volarian, its rocky exterior glowing with stress patterns. Sarah and James exchanged glances and continued walking toward the main conference hall. Behind them, they could hear rapid conversations in a dozen languages, all sounding increasingly panicked. The main conference hall was an impressive circular chamber with a massive transparent dome overhead that showed the roiling surface of Kepler 442c below. The planet was a hellish sight. Massive storms of superheated gas swirled across its surface, punctuated by volcanic eruptions that sent molten rock thousands of kilometers into the thin atmosphere. Representatives from across the galaxy were taking their seats, each in their specialized environmental gear. The ethereals floated in containment fields that kept them at near absolute zero temperatures. The silicon-based Terrans sat in specially cooled chambers that prevented their rock-like bodies from melting in the station's heat. Even the hardy Ursoid delegates, known for their resilience, wore thick atmospheric suits with their own life support systems. Sarah and James found their designated seats and sat down casually. James loosened his collar slightly. "Bit warm in here," he commented to Sarah, loud enough for nearby delegates to hear. A Thylorian delegate 2 seats overturned its massive head toward them. "Warm? The ambient temperature in this chamber is currently 62 degrees Celsius. The humidity is at 90%, and the atmospheric pressure has been increased to 1.3 standard to accommodate the various species present." "Oh," Sarah said, removing her jacket. "That explains it. I was wondering why it felt so comfortable." The Thylorian's translator made a sound that was probably equivalent to choking. Administrator Vexthal took the central platform, his form barely visible within a complex life support apparatus. "Honored delegates, welcome to the first Galactic Deathworld Environmental Summit. Over the next 3 days, we will discuss strategies for surviving and potentially colonizing the most hostile environments in known space." He gestured to the hellish world below. "Today, we orbit Kepler 442c, where the surface conditions would kill most life forms within minutes. Tomorrow, we transition to Proxima Centauri d, where the crushing gravity and sub-zero temperatures present different but equally lethal challenges. Finally, we will observe TOI 715b, where the corrosive atmosphere makes even brief exposure fatal." A crystalline delegate raised one of its sharp appendages. "Administrator, what safety protocols are in place should our environmental systems fail?" Each delegation has been provided with emergency evacuation pods rated for extreme conditions. These pods can sustain life for up to 6 hours while emergency rescue operations are conducted. Sarah leaned over to James. 6 hours? That's generous. Remember the time our life support failed on Titan? We made do with breath-holding exercises for 3 hours until the repair crew arrived. The comment was overheard by a nearby Aquarian delegate, whose tank immediately began bubbling violently, apparently the species equivalent of hyperventilating. Administrator Vexthal continued. "Our first session will focus on atmospheric adaptation. Each species will present their methods for surviving in hostile gas compositions." The first presenter was a Zephyrian, whose species was known for living in the gas giant atmospheres of their home system. Even so, the being was enclosed in a complex suit that regulated pressure and filtered the air multiple times before it reached its respiratory system. "Our species has developed advanced filtration technology that allows us to extract breathable gases from even the most toxic atmospheres," the Zephyrian explained, its voice heavily processed through multiple layers of translation and atmospheric adjustment. "However, the conditions we face here push our technology to its absolute limits." Next came an Ursoid delegate, representing one of the most physically resilient species in the galaxy. Our people can survive temperature extremes from -50 to 80 degrees Celsius. It growled through its suit's speaker system. But the conditions on these death worlds require us to push beyond our natural capabilities. When it came time for the human presentation, Sarah stood up casually and walked to the platform without any environmental gear. The entire chamber fell silent except for the hum of life support systems. Humans adapt, she said simply. We've survived ice ages where our planet's temperature dropped by 20 degrees globally. We've built cities and deserts where the daytime temperature reaches 50 degrees Celsius and the nighttime temperature drops below freezing. We live at altitudes where the air is so thin that other species would pass out from oxygen deprivation. She gestured toward the window, showing Kepler 442c. Before we developed spaceflight, humans were already living in environments that would challenge many of the species in this room. We built settlements in places where the ground itself was poisonous, where radiation levels were naturally elevated, where the air was filled with toxic particles. A Mantari delegate's translator crackled to life. But surely you don't mean to suggest that humans could survive on these death worlds without technological assistance? Sarah smiled. Define survive. If you mean thriving and building permanent settlements, then yes, we need technology. But if you mean staying alive long enough to figure things out. She shrugged. Humans have a saying, hold my beer and watch this. The translation systems struggled with that phrase, creating a cacophony of confused beeps and whistle from across the chamber. Perhaps a demonstration would be more convincing, Sarah continued. She walked over to one of the atmospheric monitoring stations and read the display. Current conditions in this chamber would be considered mildly uncomfortable by human standards. The temperature is about the same as a hot summer day in Australia. The humidity is comparable to a tropical rainforest. The atmospheric pressure is similar to what we'd experience at about 3,000 meters below sea level on Earth. She turned back to the assembled delegates. In fact, these conditions are so mild that humans regularly pay money to experience them voluntarily. We call them saunas and spas. The chamber erupted in a cacophony of shocked exclamations in dozens of languages. Administrator Vexthal's voice cut through the noise. Captain Chun, are you suggesting that these environmental conditions are recreational for your species? Oh, these conditions? Absolutely. In fact, Sarah looked thoughtful. James, didn't you say you brought your running gear? Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez nodded. Never travel without it. Was thinking of getting some exercise later. Exercise? The word was repeated by several delegates in tones of disbelief. Sure, James said, standing up. This temperature and humidity are actually perfect for a good workout. Gets the blood pumping, helps you sweat out toxins. Very refreshing. A Valerian delegate's rocky exterior began glowing bright orange, a sign of extreme agitation. You're telling us that you consider these lethal conditions to be refreshing? Lethal? Sarah looked genuinely confused. What's lethal about this? The radiation levels are barely above background. The temperature is warm, but not dangerously hot. The air has plenty of oxygen. Honestly, this is one of the more comfortable environments I've been in all week. She paused, seeming to consider something. Although, if you really want to see impressive human adaptation, you should visit the research station we built on Venus. Now that's a challenging environment. Surface temperature of 460 degrees Celsius, atmospheric pressure 92 times Earth normal, and it rains sulfuric acid. But our people have been living there for 3 years now. The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound was the hum of the station's environmental systems and the occasional stressed beeping for various delegates' life support equipment. Finally, a small voice came from the ethereal delegation. Living on Venus? Well, initially in underground habitats, Sarah clarified. But last month, the surface construction crews finished the first above-ground facility. It's actually quite nice. Great views of the volcanic activity. Administrator Vexthal's life support system made a sound like a mechanical cough. Captain Chun, are you saying that humans have established a permanent colony on one of the most hostile worlds in your solar system? Venus? Oh, that's just one of several. We've got research stations on Mercury. That's the planet closest to our sun. Surface temperature ranges from minus 170 to 430 degrees Celsius, depending on which side you're on. There's a mining operation on Io. That's a moon covered in active volcanoes and bathed in lethal radiation from Jupiter. And of course, there are the deep-sea research facilities on Earth itself. Deep sea? Asked a crystalline delegate. Oh yes, James chimed in. Humans have been exploring the deepest parts of our oceans for decades. Crushing pressure, no sunlight, near freezing temperatures, and some areas with water so acidic it would dissolve metal. We've got permanent research stations down there. Sarah nodded. And that's not even counting the extreme sports. Humans regularly throw themselves off cliffs, dive to crushing ocean depths, climb mountains where the air is too thin to breathe, and explore caves filled with toxic gases. For fun. The chamber was now filled with a low murmur of translation systems working overtime as delegates tried to process this information. Several life support systems were beeping with what sounded like distress signals. A Thylorian delegate finally managed to speak. If humans find these conditions so manageable, why did you accept the invitation to this summit? Sarah exchanged a glance with James, then smiled. We were curious to meet the species that consider this environment dangerous enough to require a summit. We wanted to understand what you find challenging about these conditions so we can help. She gestured around the chamber. We've learned a lot just from watching your approach. The environmental suits, the life support systems, the emergency protocols, it's all very impressive engineering. Humans tend to solve problems by adapting ourselves to the environment, but your approach of adapting the environment to suit your needs is fascinating. You mean you're here to help us? The question came from an Aquarian delegate whose tank was still bubbling with stress. Of course, Sarah said. That's what humans do. We see a problem, and we try to fix it. You got species that want to explore and colonize hostile worlds, but are limited by environmental challenges. Humans have been dealing with environmental challenges since before we invented the wheel. Maybe we can share some techniques. Administrator Vexthal's life support system hummed more loudly for a moment. What sort of techniques? Sarah began, counting on her fingers. Well, there's controlled breathing for managing stress in dangerous environments. Physical conditioning to improve tolerance for temperature and atmospheric variations. Mental preparation techniques for maintaining focus when everything around you is trying to kill you. Equipment improvisation for when your technology fails. Basic survival skills like finding shelter, conserving energy, and maintaining morale in hostile conditions. And those are normal skills for humans? Asked a Mantari delegate. Basic ones, James confirmed. Most human children learn at least some of these before they reach adulthood. We teach them in our schools alongside mathematics and literature. The murmur of conversation grew louder as delegates processed this information. Several species appeared to be having heated discussions in their native languages. Finally, Administrator Vexthal called for order. Honored delegates, perhaps we should take a brief recess to process this new information. We will reconvene in 1 standard hour to continue our discussions. As the other delegates filed out, their environmental suits, making them move slowly and carefully, Sarah and James remained seated, chatting casually about their plans for dinner. A small group of delegates lingered near the platform, clearly wanting to approach but uncertain how. Finally, a young Zephyrian delegate floated over, its environmental suit making soft whirring sounds. Captain Chun, I hope you don't mind me asking, but is it really true that humans live on Venus? Sarah smiled warmly. Absolutely. Would you like to see some pictures? I have some footage from the construction crews working on the surface facilities. As she pulled out her tablet, more delegates began gathering around, their curiosity overcoming their caution. Soon, Sarah was surrounded by a dozen species, all watching in amazement as she showed videos of humans working in conditions that their own species considered instantly fatal. This is fascinating, murmured an ethereal, its containment field flickering with what appeared to be excitement. Your species approaches these challenges so directly. That's humans for you, James said with a grin. We don't usually overthink things. We just try stuff and see what works. As the hour passed, more and more delegates joined the impromptu discussion. They asked questions about human physiology, human psychology, and human survival techniques. Sarah and James answered as best they could, sharing stories of human exploration and adaptation. When Administrator Vexthal called the session back to order, the atmosphere in the chamber had changed completely. The delegates still wore their environmental suits, but they seemed more relaxed, more curious than afraid. Honored delegates, Vexthal began, it appears that this summit has taken an unexpected direction. Rather than focusing solely on technological solutions to environmental challenges, we now have the opportunity to learn from a species that has developed biological and cultural adaptations. He turned towards Sarah and James. Captain Shun, Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez, would you be willing to modify our planned agenda? Instead of simply observing these death worlds from a safe distance, would you consider a more hands-on approach? Sarah and James looked at each other and grinned. Are you asking if we'd like to go down to the surface? Sarah asked. The thought had occurred to us, Vexthal admitted. With proper safety protocols, of course. Safety protocols? James laughed. Administrator, I think you're about to learn something new about humans. As the chamber fell silent, Sarah stood up and looked out at the hellish world below. The surface of Kepler, 442c, writhed with superheated storms and volcanic activity, a landscape that every species in the galaxy had deemed completely uninhabitable. When do we leave? She asked. The shuttle bay of Nexus Hub was a hive of frantic activity. Engineers from a dozen species worked frantically to modify their most advanced survival craft for what they were calling Operation Impossible. The plan was simple. Transport a human delegation to the surface of Kepler, 442c, the hellish world spinning below them, and attempt to establish a temporary research outpost. Captain Sarah Chun stood in the center of it all, wearing what the engineers had insisted was the most advanced environmental suit ever created. It was a bulky monstrosity that made her look like a walking tank, complete with its own atmospheric processor, radiation shielding, and enough emergency supplies to last a week. I can barely move in this thing, Sarah complained, trying to lift her arm. The suit's servos whined with effort. Chief Engineer Kex Nor, a crystalline being whose rocky form sparked nervously, gestured with one of his sharp appendages. Captain Shun, this suit represents the combined technological achievement of 17 different civilizations. It can withstand temperatures up to 300 degrees Celsius, pressures up to 50 Earth atmospheres, and radiation levels that would sterilize a small moon. It's very impressive, Sarah said diplomatically, then turned to James. How's yours? Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez was testing the mobility systems of his own suit. About the same. I feel like I'm wearing a small spacecraft. He attempted a jumping jack and nearly fell over as the suit's balance systems tried to compensate. Dr. Kethvar, the Thylorian mission leader, approached them with his own suit making mechanical breathing sounds. I must again express my concerns about this mission. Even with our most advanced protection, the margin for error is virtually non-existent. Sarah nodded thoughtfully, then began removing pieces of the environmental suit. You know what? I think there might be too much protection here. The shuttle bay fell silent except for the sound of various life support systems. Every engineer, delegate, and technician stopped what they were doing to stare at the human who was stripping off the most advanced survival gear in galactic history. Captain Chun, Dr. Kethvar's voice climbed several octaves. What are you doing? This suit is designed for your comfort levels, not mine, Sarah explained, setting aside the primary atmospheric processor. All this equipment is going to slow us down and create more failure points. Humans work better with simpler gear. Chief Engineer Kexnor's crystalline structure began glowing red with agitation. Captain, without that atmospheric processor, You'll be breathing the ambient air of Kepler 442c. The gas composition alone will. Will what? Sarah interrupted, pulling up the atmospheric analysis on her tablet. Let's see. 78% nitrogen, 19% oxygen, 2% argon, and trace amounts of carbon dioxide and sulfur compounds. She looked up. This is remarkably similar to Earth's atmosphere, just a bit warmer and with some extra sulfur. A bit warmer? Dr. Keth Var sputtered. The surface temperature is 200 degrees Celsius. Oh, that. Sarah waved dismissively. Humans have worked in environments approaching 100 degrees Celsius. With proper hydration and some heat adaptation techniques, 200 should be manageable for short periods. She continued stripping down the suit until she was wearing only the basic life support system and a lightweight cooling vest. Much better. Now I can actually move. James was following her lead, removing the bulkier components of his suit. This is more like it. Remember that training exercise in Death Valley? This feels similar. Death Valley, asked a small ethereal delegate who had floated over to observe. It's a desert on Earth, James explained. Average summer temperature around 50 degrees Celsius, but it can get up to 60. We used to run training exercises there for extreme environment operations. You run in 60-degree heat. The ethereal's containment field flickered with disbelief. Sure, Sarah said, adjusting her simplified gear. It's all about pacing, proper hydration, and knowing your limits. The human body is remarkably adaptable. Administrator Vexthal arrived in the shuttle bay, took one look at the human's modified equipment, and his life support system made a sound like a mechanical sigh. I should have known better than to expect humans to use standard safety protocols. Standard for whom? Sarah asked with a smile. We prefer to adapt our equipment to the mission rather than adapting the mission to our equipment. The shuttle itself was another marvel of interspecies cooperation. The Valerians had provided heat-resistant hull plating that could withstand the surface temperatures. The Aquarians had contributed advanced cooling systems. The Crystalline Collective had engineered structural supports that could handle the gravitational stresses. Even the Ethereals had added some kind of energy field stabilizer that nobody fully understood, but everyone agreed was probably helpful. As they boarded the shuttle, Sarah noticed that the entire delegation of alien representatives had gathered to watch. Some looked curious, others terrified, and a few appeared to be taking what looked like ceremonial poses, possibly preparing for what they expected to be the humans' noble but doomed sacrifice. No pressure, James muttered as they strapped in. The shuttle pilot was a Zephyrian named Vorthal, whose species were the acknowledged masters of atmospheric flight. Even so, his environmental suit was so advanced it made the human's original gear look primitive. Captain Chun, Vorthal's voice came through the comm system, heavily filtered and processed. I want you to understand that this descent profile pushes my vessel to its absolute limits. Any deviation from our planned trajectory could result in catastrophic failure. Understood, Sarah replied. Just get us down in one piece. We'll handle things from there. The descent began smoothly enough. The shuttle's heat shielding glowed as they entered the upper atmosphere, and the temperature readings on the displays climbed steadily. Outside the viewports, the sky shifted from black to a lurid orange-red as they dropped through layers of superheated gas. At 50 kilometers altitude, the first crisis hit. The shuttle's primary cooling system began struggling with the heat load. Warning! Thermal regulation approaching critical levels. The computer announced in a calm voice that somehow made the situation more terrifying. Vorthal's suit began making rapid clicking sounds, probably a species equivalent of panic breathing. I'm going to have to abort the mission. The heat levels are exceeding all safety parameters. Wait, Sarah said, checking the readings. What's the internal temperature right now? 47 degrees Celsius and climbing rapidly. Sarah looked at James, who shrugged. I've been in hotter saunas. Vorthal, keep going. We're fine. You're fine. The pilot's voice cracked with disbelief. Captain, in 3 minutes the internal temperature will reach 55 degrees. That's beyond the survival threshold for most known life forms. But not for humans, Sarah pointed out. We can handle brief exposure to temperatures up to about 80 degrees Celsius in dry heat. And this is only going to last until we reach the surface and can set up proper cooling, right? Yes, but this violates every safety protocol I know. Then, today you learned some new ones, James said cheerfully. Human safety protocols tend to be more flexible. At 30 kilometers, the second crisis hit. The atmospheric composition sensors began detecting increasing levels of sulfur compounds and other trace gases that were toxic to most species. Warning, atmospheric contamination approaching dangerous levels, the computer announced. Define dangerous, Sarah said, reading the sensor data. These sulfur compound levels are about the same as what you'd find near an active volcano on Earth. Unpleasant, but not immediately lethal. You have volcanoes on your homeworld? Vorthal asked. Hundreds of them, James replied. Some of our cities are built practically on top of active volcanic systems. Great geothermal energy, though the air quality can be a bit challenging. At 10 kilometers, they hit the third crisis. The gravitational readings showed that the planet's rotation was creating localized gravity fluctuations that could destabilize the shuttle. This is unprecedented, Vorthal muttered, his suit's systems working overtime to process the stress hormones his body was producing. Gravity variations of this magnitude should tear the shuttle apart. Sarah looked at the readings and frowned. These variations are only about 15% above standard gravity. That's less than what our astronauts experience during launch acceleration. 15% is enormous. Not really, James said. Human athletes regularly train at higher gravity loads. We've got centrifuge facilities on Earth that can simulate up to 5 times standard gravity for training and sometimes for fun, Sarah added. There are amusement park rides that pull higher G-forces than this. Amusement parks? Entertainment facilities where humans voluntarily subject themselves to various forms of controlled danger, Sarah explained. Roller coasters, bungee jumps, skydiving, that sort of thing. The shuttle finally broke through the lower atmosphere and began its approach to the surface. Through the viewports, they could see the hellish landscape of Kepler, 442c spread out below them. Massive volcanic formations jutted from a cracked and twisted surface. Rivers of molten rock carved glowing channels across the terrain. Steam vents erupted regularly, sending columns of superheated gas kilometers into the air. There, Sarah pointed to a relatively flat area between 2 major volcanic complexes. That looks like a good landing site. Good. Vorthal's voice was now pure mechanical processing with no organic component audible. Captain, that site is located between 2 active thermal vents. The ground temperature there is probably close to the melting point of most metals. But it's flat and stable, James observed. And those thermal vents will provide a ready source of geothermal energy if we want to set up any equipment. You want to harness the geological forces that are trying to kill you. That's pretty much human engineering in a nutshell, Sarah said with a grin. The landing was surprisingly gentle. Vorthal, despite his terror, was clearly a master pilot. The shuttle settled onto the superheated surface with barely a tremor. Surface contact confirmed, the computer announced. External temperature, 187 degrees Celsius. Atmospheric pressure, 1.4 standard. Radiation levels, elevated but within acceptable parameters for short-term exposure. Sarah and James began their final equipment checks. They'd be wearing breathing masks to filter out the worst of the sulfur compounds, and their cooling vests would help manage the heat, but otherwise they were relying on standard human environmental tolerance. Are you absolutely certain about this? Vorthal asked one final time. Sarah opened the shuttle's airlock and looked out at the alien landscape. The air shimmered with heat, and she could see the ground itself glowing in places where the thermal activity was most intense. Steam rose from fissures in the rock, and in the distance, a massive geyser of lava painted the orange sky an even deeper red. It's beautiful, she said simply. She stepped out onto the surface of Kepler, 442c. The heat hit her immediately, like walking into a giant oven. The air was thick and humid, tinged with the sharp smell of sulfur and metal. Each breath felt substantial, heavy with moisture and heat. The ground beneath her feet was warm enough that she could feel it through her boots. "How is it?" James asked, preparing to follow. "Hot," Sarah admitted, "but manageable. The humidity actually helps, keeps you from dehydrating as quickly as you would in dry heat." James stepped out and immediately began sweating. "Wow, this is like that summer I spent working construction in Arizona, except turned up to 11. They walked about 50 meters from the shuttle, testing their mobility and getting a feel for the environment. The gravity was indeed higher than Earth's standard, but not uncomfortably so. The air was breathable with their simple filters. The radiation levels, while elevated, were comparable to what they might experience at high altitude or during certain solar events. "Vorthal," Sarah called back to the shuttle, "we're going to do a brief survey of the area, collect some samples, test the geological stability, maybe set up a temporary monitoring station." "You're taking a walk," Vorthal said flatly. "More like a hike," James corrected, pulling out a geological sampling kit. "This terrain is fascinating. Look at these mineral formations." They spent the next 2 hours exploring the immediate area around the landing site. Sarah collected atmospheric readings while James documented the geological features. They found several stable areas that would be suitable for temporary structures, identified water sources in the form of underground steam vents, and even discovered what appeared to be mineral deposits that could be useful for construction. "This place has serious potential," Sarah said, making notes on her tablet. "The geothermal energy alone could power a significant research facility. And these mineral deposits, some of these elements are rare on most worlds." "The soil composition is interesting too," James added, sealing a sample container. "With some basic treatment, this could be made suitable for agriculture. The high temperature would actually accelerate plant growth for heat-tolerant crops." They were interrupted by a transmission from the shuttle. "Captain Chun, this is Nexus Hub Control. We're receiving your telemetry data, and are you certain your sensors are functioning correctly?" "Everything's working fine," Sarah replied. "Why? According to our readings, you've been on the surface for 2 hours and 17 minutes. You've traveled approximately 3 kilometers from your landing site. Your vital signs show elevated but stable readings consistent with moderate physical exertion." "That's correct." "Captain, this is impossible. No known life form can survive on that surface for more than a few minutes without complete environmental protection." Sarah looked around at the hellish but oddly beautiful landscape. In the distance, a massive volcanic eruption painted the sky with flowing lines of molten rock. Steam vents created natural hot springs that might have been relaxing under other circumstances. The air itself seemed to glow with heat distortion. "Well," she said finally, "I guess humans are a bit different." Back on Nexus Hub, the various delegates were gathered in the main conference room, watching the telemetry feeds from the surface mission with expressions of complete disbelief. "They're collecting samples," said Dr. Kethvar, his voice hollow with shock. "They're making jokes," added Chief Engineer Kexnor, whose crystalline form was flickering through a spectrum of confused colors. "One of them just sat down to eat lunch," reported an Aquarian delegate, whose tank was bubbling so violently it looked like a storm system. Administrator Vexthal stared at the displays showing the human's location, vital signs, and video feed. "They're treating the most hostile environment in known space like a camping trip." On the surface, Sarah and James had indeed stopped for lunch. They'd found a relatively cool spot in the shade of a large rock formation. Cool being a relative term, since the ambient temperature was still about 170 degrees Celsius. "Pass the water," James said, unwrapping a protein bar. "This heat really works up a sweat." Sarah handed him a hydration pack. "We'll need to be careful about electrolyte balance. Good thing we brought the extra salt tablets." "Are you two having a picnic?" Vorthal's voice came through their comm systems, still heavy with mechanical processing, but now with an undertone of existential crisis. "Just a quick break," Sarah said. We want to hike over to that interesting rock formation about a kilometer north. The mineral striations look like they might indicate some unusual geological processes. You want to hike further into this hellscape. It's not so bad once you get used to it, James said, taking another bite of his protein bar. Reminds me of that survival training we did in the Sahara, except more humid. The Sahara? Large desert on Earth. Gets pretty hot during the day. We used to do training exercises there to prepare for extreme environment operations. Sarah stood up and brushed rock dust off her cooling vest. Vorthal, we're going to extend our surface time by about 3 hours. There's a lot more to see here, and the data we're collecting is invaluable. 3 hours? Captain, you've already been on the surface longer than any life form in galactic history. Adding 3 more hours is what? James asked, genuinely curious. Is rewriting everything we thought we knew about environmental limitations, Vorthal finished quietly. As they resumed their exploration, Sarah found herself thinking about the implications of their little field trip. The galaxy was full of worlds that were considered uninhabitable simply because they fell outside the narrow environmental parameters that most species found comfortable. But many of these worlds probably had valuable resources, strategic locations, or scientific importance. James, she said as they climbed over a ridge to get a better view of a massive volcanic complex. I think we might be looking at this all wrong. How so? Everyone talks about these places as death worlds, but what if they're just different? What if the problem isn't that these environments are impossible to survive in, but that most species haven't developed the right approaches? James paused to take readings of a thermal vent that was shooting superheated steam 50 meters into the air. You mean like how humans learn to survive in Arctic conditions by developing better clothing and shelter techniques instead of just avoiding cold places? Exactly. We didn't evolve to live in the Arctic, but we figured out how to do it anyway. Maybe other species could learn to adapt to more extreme environments if they approached the problem differently. They spent the rest of their extended surface time documenting everything they could find. Rock formations, thermal patterns, atmosphere variations, geological stability, all the data that would be needed to establish a permanent research presence. As they finally made their way back to the shuttle, both humans were tired, dehydrated, and covered in mineral dust, but otherwise in good health. That was incredible, Sarah said as they reached the shuttle. This world has so much potential. Agreed, James said. With proper planning, you could build a real research facility here. Maybe even a permanent colony eventually. Vorthal's shuttle had been sitting on a superheated surface for over 6 hours, and his environmental systems were running at maximum capacity just to keep him alive inside his protective gear. When the humans casually walked up to the airlock and climbed aboard, looking like they'd been on nothing more challenging than a nature hike, his alien mind finally reached its breaking point. "Ow," he asked simply. Sarah looked at him with genuine sympathy. Vorthal, your species evolved to fly through the gentle atmospheres of gas giants. You're built for grace and elegance in three-dimensional movement. Humans evolved to chase prey across burning savannas for hours at a time. We're built for endurance in hostile environments. But this world should have killed you. This world is challenging, James corrected. But humans have been dealing with challenging environments for our entire evolutionary history. We're not stronger or smarter than other species, but we are remarkably persistent and adaptable. As they lifted off from the surface, Sarah looked back at the hellish but fascinating world they were leaving behind. Vorthal, would you be interested in helping establish a permanent research station here? You want to come back? Of course. This place is amazing. Think of what we could learn, what we could discover. And with human environmental adaptation techniques combined with your species' engineering capabilities, we could build something incredible. Vorthal was quiet for a long moment as they climbed back toward Nexus Hub. Finally, he spoke. Captain Chun, I think this summit is going to be very different from what any of us expected. As they docked with the station, they could see through the viewports that every available observation deck was packed with delegates from dozens of species, all watching their return. When Sarah and James walked out of the shuttle in their simple gear, looking tired but healthy, the entire station fell silent. Then, slowly, one delegate began what could only be described as applauding. Then, another joined in, and another, until the entire docking bay was filled with the various expressions of approval from species across the galaxy. "Well," Sarah said to James as they walked through the crowd of amazed aliens, "I think we made an impression. Think they're ready for the next phase?" James asked. Sarah grinned. "Tomorrow we visit the ice world. I'm thinking we teach them about winter camping." The transition to Proxima Centauri D came with its own spectacle. As Nexus Hub adjusted its orbit, the delegates gathered in the observation lounges to watch the approach to what was considered the most physically challenging world in known space. The planet below was a frozen wasteland where the gravity was 4 times Earth standard and the surface temperature never rose above minus 150 degrees Celsius. Captain Sarah Chun stood at the primary viewport, but unlike the previous day, she wasn't alone. A small crowd of alien delegates had gathered around her and Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez, eager to hear their assessment of this new challenge. Preliminary scans indicate surface gravity of 4.2 Earth standard, reported Dr. Kethvar, reading from his environmental sensors. Surface temperature averaging minus 157 degrees Celsius. Atmospheric pressure less than 0.1 standard. Atmospheric composition is primarily nitrogen and argon with trace amounts of frozen water vapor. So a cold, high-gravity world with thin air, Sarah summarized. Basically like climbing a mountain on a really cold day. The assembled delegates made various sounds of disbelief through their translation systems. A young crystalline engineer named Zextal, whose species was known for logical thinking, approached the humans. "Captain Shun, with respect, I have calculated that the gravitational force alone would make movement virtually impossible for most species. Add the temperature and atmospheric conditions, and this world represents a death sentence within minutes." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "The gravity will definitely be challenging. 4 times Earth standard means everything weighs 4 times as much, including our own bodies. That's like trying to move around while carrying 3 extra copies of yourself." "Exactly." Zextal's crystalline structure brightened with vindication. "It would be impossible to function under such conditions." "Well, difficult," James corrected. "But humans have actually trained in higher gravity environments. Our military uses centrifuge training that can simulate up to 6 times Earth gravity." "For how long?" asked an ethereal delegate whose containment field was flickering with curiosity. "Depend on the training program," Sarah replied. "Short bursts of 10 to 12 Gs for a few minutes. Sustained periods at 4 to 5 Gs for up to an hour. The record for extended high-gravity endurance is about 8 hours at 3 times standard gravity." 8 hours? The ethereal's field fluctuated wildly. "You voluntarily subject yourselves to crushing gravitational forces for 8 hours. Training," James explained, "prepares you for emergency situations where you might encounter high-gravity environments. Plus, it's great exercise. Really builds core strength." Dr. Kethvar's environmental suit made sounds like mechanical choking. "And the temperature? Minus 157 degrees Celsius would freeze most biological tissues solid within seconds." "That's pretty cold," Sarah admitted. "But humans have survived in extreme cold before. The coldest natural temperature ever recorded on Earth was minus 89 degrees Celsius. People live and work in Antarctica year-round, where winter temperatures regularly hit minus 60 to minus 80. But you said yourself this is much colder than your polar regions," pointed out Chief Engineer Kexnor. "True, but we've also developed techniques for dealing with extreme cold. Proper clothing, shelter construction, body heat management, caloric intake optimization. The cold itself isn't the main challenge. It's maintaining your body's core temperature while remaining functional." Administrator Vexthal approached the group, his life support system humming with what sounded like resignation. "Captain Shun, am I correct in assuming that you intend to visit the surface of this world as well?" "If that's all right with you," Sarah replied. The data we collected on Kepler 442c was extremely valuable. I think a similar survey of this ice world could provide important insights. Very well, but I insist on additional safety protocols this time. The risks are manageable with proper preparation, Sarah finished. Though I do have one request. What's that? Sarah looked around at the assembled delegates. I'd like to invite some volunteers to join us on the surface. The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound was the hum of various life support systems and the distant vibration of the station's environmental controls. Finally, a small voice spoke up. Join you on the surface? It was Zextal, the young crystalline engineer. His rocky form was cycling through colors that probably indicated a mixture of terror and fascination. Sure, James said enthusiastically. With proper preparation and safety protocols, real ones, not just bigger suits, I think several species here could handle a brief surface visit. That's impossible, Dr. Kethvar protested. The environmental conditions would kill any of us within minutes. Only if you approach it the wrong way, Sarah said. The key is understanding that you don't fight hostile environments. You adapt to them. Work with the conditions instead of against them. She turned to address the growing crowd of delegates. How many of you have actually experienced true environmental challenges on your own worlds? A few hesitant appendages, field fluctuations, and other species-specific gestures indicated a small number of delegates. The Volarian mining colonies, rumbled a delegate whose rocky exterior was glowing with nervous energy. We work deep underground where the heat and pressure would crush most species. Excellent, Sarah said. Your people understand environmental adaptation. What about the rest of you? An Aquarian delegate bubbled nervously in their tank. Our species has established research stations in the deep oceanic trenches of our homeworld. Crushing pressure, no light, temperatures near freezing. Perfect. And the ethereals? The ethereal representatives' containment field pulsed thoughtfully. We explore the void between stars. True vacuum, radiation, temperatures approaching absolute zero. See? James spread his hands. Every species here has experience with extreme environments. You've just been thinking about this particular challenge the wrong way. Over the next several hours, Sarah and James worked with the engineering teams to develop what they called adaptive protocols rather than protection protocols. Instead of building bigger suits to protect the aliens from the environment, they focused on helping each species understand how to adapt their existing capabilities to handle the new challenges. For the Valerians, it was about understanding how to manage heat loss in extreme cold using their species' natural ability to regulate their internal temperature. For the Aquarians, it was about applying their deep ocean pressure resistance to high-gravity situations. For the crystallines, it was about using their structural integrity advantages to handle gravitational stress. For the ethereals, it was about leveraging their void adaptation capabilities to deal with thin atmospheres and extreme temperature variations. The key, Sarah explained to the assembled engineering teams, is understanding that hostile environments aren't trying to kill you personally. They're just different. Every environmental challenge has a solution. You just have to find the right approach. Chief Engineer Kexnor was working on modifications to his own environmental suit, stripping away redundant systems and focusing on the specific challenges they would face. This is a completely different design philosophy from anything we've used before. How do you mean? Asked James. Our traditional approach is to create a perfect artificial environment within our suits, maintaining our homeworld conditions regardless of external factors. Your approach seems to be about accommodating the external environment while maintaining only essential life support. Exactly, Sarah nodded. It's the difference between building a submarine to explore the ocean floor and training yourself to be a better swimmer. Both can work, but one is much more flexible and adaptable. As they prepared for the surface mission, word spread throughout Nexus Hub about the ambitious plan. Delegates from species that had never even considered setting foot on a Deathworld were volunteering for the surface expedition. The original plan for a simple human reconnaissance mission had evolved into the largest interspecies environmental adaptation experiment in galactic history. The shuttle bay was bustling with activity as multiple vessels were prepared for the descent. The humans would take the lead shuttle with their minimal environmental gear. The volunteer delegates would follow in a second shuttle with their modified adaptive equipment. And a third shuttle would serve as emergency backup and communications relay. Final systems check, announced Vorthal, who had volunteered to pilot the lead shuttle again. His environmental suit was noticeably less bulky than the previous day, though still far more protective than what the humans were wearing. Sarah and James were dressed in what looked like advanced winter gear, insulated clothing, heating elements powered by small fuel cells, breathing apparatus designed for thin atmospheres, and boots with magnetic clamps for high-gravity mobility. Temperature regulation check, James reported. Heating system operational. Battery life estimated at 12 hours continuous use. Breathing apparatus check, Sarah added. Oxygen concentration and CO2 scrubbing systems functional. Emergency oxygen supply sufficient for 4 hours. Mobility systems check. They both reported together, testing the magnetic boot systems and movement assistance mechanisms. Dr. Kethvar boarded with his heavily modified suit. He'd worked with the engineering teams to remove most of the redundant protection systems, focusing instead on core temperature maintenance and gravitational support. He looked terrified but determined. Zextal was next, his crystalline form now equipped with thermal regulators and gravity compensators that worked with his species' natural structural integrity instead of against it. An Aquarian named Fluxera had modified their mobile tank system to handle the extreme conditions, while an ethereal calling itself Void Whisper had adapted their containment field to serve as environmental protection rather than species isolation. Even a Valerian delegate, stone-faced Rockdan, had joined the expedition with equipment designed to help their species' natural heat management work in reverse, retaining warmth instead of dissipating it. This is either the bravest or most foolish thing any of us have ever done, Dr. Kethvar muttered as they prepared for descent. Probably both, Sarah agreed cheerfully. That's usually how humans make progress. The descent to Proxima Centauri D was remarkably smooth compared to the previous day's thermal chaos. The thin atmosphere meant less buffeting, and the cold temperatures actually made the shuttle's systems run more efficiently. Approaching the surface, Vorthal reported. External temperature now reading minus 162 degrees Celsius. Gravity registering at 4.3 Earth standard. Atmospheric pressure at 0.08 standard. Through the viewports, they could see the alien landscape spread out below them. Unlike the chaotic volcanic hellscape of Kepler 442c, this world was stark and beautiful in its simplicity. Vast plains of frozen nitrogen stretched to the horizon, broken by massive ice formations that caught the dim light of the distant star. Here and there, geysers of sublimating gas created towering columns that disappeared into the thin atmosphere. "It's beautiful," whispered Fluxera, their tank systems humming with excitement. "And deadly," Dr. Kethvar added, but his voice held wonder as well as fear. They landed on a flat plain near a formation of methane ice cliffs that would provide some shelter from the constant wind. The moment the shuttle touched down, everyone could feel the increased gravity pressing them into their seats. "Whoa," James grunted, struggling to stand up. 4 times gravity is no joke. It's like doing everything while wearing a 300-pound weight vest. Sarah managed to get to her feet, but her movements were slow and deliberate. Remember the training protocols. Small movements, conserve energy, focus on maintaining balance. They began their preparations for leaving the shuttle. The humans went through their equipment checks with practiced efficiency, while the alien volunteers double and triple-checked their modified systems. Environmental seals confirmed, Zextal reported, his voice tight with nervousness. Thermal regulation online, Dr. Kethvar added. Pressure compensation systems functional, Fluxera bubbled. Sarah opened the shuttle's airlock and looked out at the frozen world. The cold hit like a physical blow, even through her insulated gear. Her breath immediately formed crystals that fell like snow in the heavy gravity. The air itself seemed to crackle with cold. "It's like stepping into a freezer," she reported, "but manageable. The air is thin but breathable with assistance. The gravity is challenging but not impossible." She stepped out onto the surface, her magnetic boots clamping to the frozen ground with each step. The increased weight made every movement deliberate and exhausting, but she managed to walk about 10 meters from the shuttle. James followed, his movements equally slow and careful. "The cold is actually less of a problem than I expected. The insulation is working well. The gravity is the main challenge. It's like doing physical therapy with lead weights strapped to every limb." One by one, the alien volunteers emerged from the shuttle. Dr. Kethvar moved like he was walking through thick syrup, his suit's gravitational compensators whining with effort. Zextal's crystalline form seemed to handle the gravity better, his species' natural structural strength giving him an advantage. Fluxera's tank system had been modified with additional support systems that distributed the gravitational load more evenly. The Aquarian moved slowly but steadily across the frozen surface. Void Whisperer was perhaps the most adaptable, their ethereal nature allowing them to partially compensate for the gravity through field manipulation, though they still struggled with the physical reality of the increased weight. Rockdan, the Valerian, surprised everyone by adapting quickly to the conditions. Their species' natural weight and density actually worked in their favor under high gravity, and their thermal management systems proved remarkably effective at retaining heat in the extreme cold. "This is incredible," Dr. Kethvar said, his voice filled with amazement as he looked around at the alien landscape. "I'm standing on a death world, and I'm not dying." "You're not just standing," Sarah pointed out with a smile. "You're exploring. You're collecting data. You're proving that your species can adapt to conditions you thought were impossible." They spent the next 4 hours conducting the most comprehensive survey of an extreme environment in galactic history. Each species contributed their unique perspectives and capabilities to the data collection. The crystallines proved excellent at geological analysis, their natural ability to interact with mineral structures providing insights into the planet's formation and composition. The Aquarians, with their fluid dynamics expertise, helped map the complex atmospheric flows and pressure variations across the surface. The Ethereals used their energy manipulation abilities to detect and analyze various radiation sources and energy fields that other species couldn't perceive. The Volarians, with their deep drilling experience, identified subsurface features and potential resource deposits. And the humans coordinated it all, their adaptability allowing them to work effectively with each species while maintaining overall mission cohesion. "Look at this," Zextal called out, his crystalline form brightening with excitement. "These ice formations show evidence of regular thermal cycling. There might be geothermal activity underneath. And these atmospheric readings," added Fluxera, "suggest there are seasonal variations we hadn't detected from orbit. This world isn't as static as we thought." Dr. Kethvar was documenting what appeared to be frozen microbial life forms. "There's actually biological activity here, dormant but present. This world could potentially be terraformed with the right approach." As their surface time extended, something remarkable happened. The alien delegates stopped thinking of themselves as visitors to a hostile environment and began thinking of themselves as explorers of a new frontier. Void Whisperer said, their containment field pulsing with something that might have been contentment. "This isn't actually much worse than some of the void regions my people explore regularly. Just different challenges." "The gravity is exhausting," Dr. Kethvar admitted, "but it's not impossible. With proper conditioning and techniques, extended operations here would be feasible. My people could establish mining operations here," Rockdan rumbled. "The mineral resources are extensive, and the environmental challenges are manageable with proper adaptation." As they finally, prepared to return to the shuttle, Sarah realized that something fundamental had changed. These weren't alien delegates learning to tolerate extreme environments. They were becoming explorers, pioneers, people who saw challenges instead of impossibilities. "This has been incredible," Zextal said as they made their way back to the shuttle, their movements now more confident despite the continued gravitational strain. "We've spent so long thinking about environmental limitations that we never considered environmental possibilities." Back on Nexus Hub, the returning expedition was greeted with something approaching a celebration. Word had spread throughout the station about the successful multi-species surface mission, and delegates from dozens of civilizations had gathered to hear their reports. But more than that, Sarah noticed a change in how the aliens were talking about the environments around them. Instead of discussing the station's dangerously elevated temperature and humidity, they were talking about optimal thermal conditions for extended operations. Instead of complaining about atmosphere pressure variations, they were analyzing adaptive atmospheric management techniques. "Ladies, gentlemen, and beings of various classifications," Administrator Vexthal addressed the assembled crowd, "I believe this summit has achieved something unprecedented. We have moved beyond simply surviving in extreme environments to actually thriving in them." He turned to Sarah and James. "Captain Chun, Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez, your species has taught us something valuable. Environmental challenges are not barriers to be overcome with bigger and more complex technology. They are puzzles to be solved through adaptation, cooperation, and understanding." Sarah nodded. "And you've all proven that every species has unique capabilities that can contribute to that adaptation. The key is working together and thinking creatively about how to apply your natural strengths to new challenges. Which brings us," Vexthal continued, "to our final challenge. Tomorrow we visit TOI 715b, a world where the atmosphere is composed primarily of sulfuric acid vapor, and the surface is constantly scoured by corrosive storms." The chamber fell silent for a moment, then gradually filled with excited conversation as delegates began discussing adaptive strategies for this new challenge. Dr. Kethvar approached Sarah and James. "Captain, I have a confession to make." "What's that?" "When we first invited humans to this summit, we expected you to provide some insights into survival techniques, perhaps share some interesting stories about your homeworld's environmental diversity." Sarah smiled. "And instead, you've completely revolutionized how we think about environmental adaptation. You've turned a summit about Deathworlds into a planning session for interstellar expansion." James laughed. "That's humans for you. We don't just survive hostile environments. We turn them into home." As the delegates dispersed to prepare for the final day of the summit, Sarah looked out at the stars through the observation viewport. Somewhere out there were thousands of worlds that the galaxy had written off as uninhabitable death worlds. But now, thanks to this summit, dozens of species were beginning to see those same worlds as challenges to be overcome, puzzles to be solved, and frontiers to be explored. "Think they're ready for the acid world?" James asked. Sarah grinned. "After today, I think they're ready for anything." The next morning would bring the final test, a world where the very air could dissolve metal and the storms could strip flesh from bone. But looking around at the excited, determined faces of the alien delegates, Sarah was confident that they would find a way to adapt, to overcome, and to thrive. After all, they were learning to think like humans. And humans, as the galaxy was rapidly discovering, didn't believe in impossible environments, only environments that hadn't been figured out yet.